The evil Appalachian sisters and their surgical cellar. 29 men lured and sterilized in the name of God. That's what the diary revealed, written in Agatha's own hand. Each entry a cold record of what she called purification. 2 respected healers, 2 spinster sisters who the whole mountain community trusted with their lives. Agatha and Iris welcomed broken men into their home, offering food, shelter, and promises of healing. But beneath their house of prayer lay a sterile operating room, leather restraints, chloroform, and instruments of mutilation. For years, men left their care, different, quieter, empty-eyed. The town whispered but never questioned, until 1898 when 20-year-old Ara found her dead mother's final warning hidden in the floorboards. The cellar holds their righteousness and my regret. But when she tried to expose the truth, the entire community turned against her. Why would a town choose to protect monsters? And how many more victims were there that no one will ever know? The mountain mist clung to the hollows like smoke from a dying fire, and she felt the weight of it settle into her bones as the wagon lurched up the final stretch of rutted road toward her aunt's house. 20 years old and orphaned, she clutched her mother's worn leather satchel against her chest, the only tangible piece of home she had left. The driver, a weathered man who'd spoken little during the 3-hour journey from the railway station, finally broke his silence as an austere wooden structure emerged from the pine shadows ahead. "That's the Blackwood place," he said, his voice carrying an odd mixture of reverence and unease. "Your aunts, they're fine women, godly women, done more healing in these parts than any doctor ever could." He paused, studying the house with narrowed eyes. Of course they keep to themselves mostly, always have. The house stood like a testament to rigid order, its white-painted boards gleaming against the dark forest backdrop, despite the autumn of 1898 having already begun to strip the trees bare. Not a single shutter hung crooked. Not one board showed signs of weathering or neglect. Even the garden plot beside the front porch displayed perfect rows of late-season herbs, each plant precisely spaced and carefully tended. It was beautiful in its severity, but Ara found herself longing for the comfortable chaos of her mother's little cottage with its crooked fence and wildflowers that bloomed wherever they pleased. Agatha emerged first, her tall frame filling the doorway like a sentinel. At 48, she possessed the kind of stark beauty that commanded attention. Steel-grey hair pulled back in a severe knot, pale blue eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail of Ara's appearance, and a mouth that appeared incapable of softness. Her dark dress was immaculate, buttoned to the throat despite the afternoon warmth, and her hands, Ara noticed, were spotlessly clean with nails trimmed to perfect crescents. "Ara," Agatha said, her voice carrying the authority of a judge pronouncing sentence, "you've grown tall like your mother. Come inside. Iris has prepared a room for you." Behind her sister's imposing figure, Iris appeared like a shadow-seeking substance. 3 years younger than Agatha, but somehow appearing more fragile, she possessed the same pale eyes, but hers held a gentleness that bordered on apology. Where Agatha's presence demanded acknowledgement, Iris seemed to shrink from attention, her movements careful and measured, as if she feared taking up too much space in the world. "Welcome home, child," Iris said softly, reaching for Ara's bag with hands that trembled slightly. "I'm sorry for your loss. Your mother she was very dear to us once." The interior of the house reflected the same meticulous order as its exterior. Every surface gleamed with recent polish. Every book stood in perfect alignment on the shelves, and the air carried the sharp scent of carbolic soap mingled with dried herbs hanging in neat bundles from the kitchen rafters. Ara's room, tucked beneath the eaves on the second floor, was sparse but clean. A narrow bed with crisp white linens, a washstand with a pitcher and basin, and a single window that looked out over the herb garden and into the forest beyond. "We rise at dawn," Agatha announced from the doorway, her voice brooking no discussion. "Morning prayers, then breakfast, then work. The Lord's day is for rest and reflection, but the other 6 days are for service. You'll learn our ways quickly enough." In the days that followed, Ara threw herself into understanding those ways, with the desperate energy of someone seeking purpose in grief. She learned the names of the plants that crowded the sisters' garden and the surrounding mountainsides: foxglove for the heart, willow bark for pain, poppy for sleep. Agatha proved a demanding but thorough teacher, her extensive knowledge of medicinal herbs rivaling anything Ara had read in her mother's old books. Iris, gentler in her instruction, showed Ara how to prepare tinctures and poultices, how to dry leaves and roots to preserve their potency, and how to recognize the subtle signs that indicated when a plant was ready for harvest. The community's reverence for the sisters became apparent almost immediately. Farmers arrived with wives suffering difficult pregnancies. Mothers brought children burning with fever, and elderly men sought relief from joints stiffened by decades of hard labor. Word would spread through the hollows when the Blackwood sisters had worked another miracle. A baby delivered safely after hours of struggle. A child's fever broken just when death seemed imminent. A man able to walk without pain for the first time in years. But it was the male visitors who presented the most intriguing aspect of her aunt's practice. These men arrived alone, usually after dark, carrying themselves with the particular shame of those who had exhausted other options. Railroad workers with mysterious ailments, drifters complaining of weakness and fatigue, farmers from distant hollows who spoke in hushed tones about problems they couldn't bring themselves to name in mixed company. Agatha would greet them with the same stern efficiency she showed everyone, but Iris would hover nearby with an almost maternal concern, pressing food into their hands and speaking in soothing murmurs about healing and redemption. "These men require special care," Agatha explained to Ara after the 3rd such visitor in as many nights. "Their conditions are delicate. We treat them in the back room where they can maintain their dignity while receiving proper attention. Some procedures take several days to complete properly." The back room, Ara learned, was strictly forbidden territory, located behind the kitchen and accessible only through a door that Agatha kept locked. It had apparently been converted into a treatment space for these particular patients. The sisters would disappear into this sanctuary for hours at a time, emerging only to prepare special meals or gather specific herbs. The men who emerged after their treatment seemed different somehow, quieter, more subdued, their eyes holding a peculiar vacancy that Ara attributed to the relief that came with healing. Standing in her small window one evening, as autumn painted the mountains in shades of rust and gold, Ara allowed herself to feel the first stirrings of something she had thought lost forever: hope. Perhaps here in this house of healing and purpose, she could honor her mother's memory by continuing a tradition of service. Perhaps in learning her aunt's ways, she could find the family and belonging that death had stolen from her. The mountain mist swirled around the house like a protective embrace, and for the first time since arriving, Ara dared to believe that she had found her place in the world. The first crack in Ara's carefully constructed hope appeared 3 weeks after her arrival, on a morning when the autumn air carried the sharp promise of an early winter. She had risen before dawn to help Iris prepare breakfast when she noticed a man emerging from the back room, one of the railroad workers who had arrived 4 nights earlier, complaining of chronic fatigue and mysterious pains in his abdomen. The transformation was startling. Where once he had carried himself with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to physical labor, he now moved with hesitant, almost fearful steps. His shoulders curved inward, as if protecting himself from some invisible threat. And when he glanced toward the kitchen window, where Ara stood watching, his eyes held a hollow quality that made her stomach clench with inexplicable dread. "He's much improved," Agatha announced with satisfaction as she entered the kitchen, wiping her hands on a spotless white towel. The Lord's work often requires sacrifice before redemption can take hold. He understands that now. But Ara had seen enough suffering in her 20 years to recognize the difference between the peaceful exhaustion of healing and the broken resignation that emanated from the departing man, like heat from a dying fire. When Iris pressed a cloth bundle of food into his hands with gentle murmurs about taking care of himself, the man flinched away from her touch, as if it burned. He left without speaking, disappearing into the morning mist with the hurried gait of someone fleeing rather than departing. Over the following days, Ara began to pay closer attention to the male patients who sought her aunt's specialized care. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Men would arrive carrying themselves with various degrees of confidence and hope, seeking healing for ailments they described in whispered, shame-filled conversations with Agatha. After several days of treatment in the forbidden back room, they would emerge fundamentally altered, not healed in any recognizable sense, but diminished, as if some essential part of their humanity had been carefully extracted, along with whatever physical complaint had brought them seeking help. The most disturbing incident occurred on a rain-soaked evening in late October. Ara was mending a tear in her skirt by the parlor window when she heard urgent knocking at the front door. Through the glass, she could see a man of perhaps 30 years, his clothes soaked through and his face etched with desperate concern. Agatha answered the door with her usual stern composure, but Ara noticed how her posture stiffened when the visitor began speaking in low, urgent tones. "I'm looking for my brother Thomas," the man said, his voice carrying across the quiet house, despite his obvious attempts to keep the conversation private. "Thomas Henley. He came here 8 days ago seeking treatment for stomach troubles. Said you ladies had a reputation for helping men with delicate conditions, but he never came home, and my wife's beside herself with worry." Agatha's response was swift and cutting. "I'm afraid I cannot discuss the private medical affairs of my patients. Mr. Henley, your brother received the treatment he required and departed of his own accord 3 days ago. If he has chosen not to return to his family immediately, perhaps you should examine what circumstances in his home life might have influenced such a decision." The accusation hung in the air like a physical blow. Ara watched the man's face cycle through confusion, hurt, and finally anger as Agatha's words sank in. "Thomas wouldn't just disappear," he insisted, his voice rising despite his obvious effort to maintain respectability. "He's got responsibilities, a job at the mill. Something's happened to him, and I need to know what treatment you gave him." "Lower your voice," Agatha commanded, with the authority of a schoolmistress dealing with an unruly child. "I will not have you bringing your accusations and implications to my doorstep. Your brother came to us broken in spirit and body, seeking redemption for sins that had festered in his soul. We provided what healing we could, but some men are too far gone for earthly intervention. If Thomas has chosen to wander rather than face his shame, that is between him and his Maker." The man stood in stunned silence for several heartbeats before turning away without another word. Ara watched him disappear into the rain-darkened forest, his shoulders bent under a burden she couldn't fully comprehend. When she turned back toward the parlor, she found Agatha studying her with those pale, calculating eyes. "Some families," Agatha said quietly, "refuse to acknowledge the darkness that lives within their own blood. They prefer comfortable lies to difficult truths. Remember that, child, when you encounter such willful blindness in this world." But it was Ara's own willful blindness that shattered completely 2 days later, when, while sweeping the narrow space beneath her bed, she felt her broom handle catch against something solid lodged between the floorboards. Curious, she worked the loose board free and discovered a small cavity that had obviously been deliberately carved into the floor joists. Hidden within this secret space was a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age, and its cover worn smooth by countless hands. The moment she opened to the first page and saw her mother's familiar handwriting, Ara's heart began racing with a mixture of excitement and inexplicable fear. The early entries painted a picture of the loving relationship she remembered, her mother's deep admiration for her older sister's knowledge and dedication, her pride in their growing reputation as healers, and her hope that their work represented a divine calling to serve their isolated community. But as Ara read deeper into the journal, the tone began to shift in subtle, troubling ways. References appeared to treatments that seemed too harsh to male patients who left their care in conditions that troubled her mother's conscience, and to conversations with Agatha that grew increasingly cryptic and disturbing. The final entries were written in handwriting that grew progressively more agitated, the words occasionally smeared as if tears had fallen on the fresh ink. Her mother wrote of discovering something in the cellar that had shattered her faith in her sister's mission. Something so horrific that she could barely bring herself to record even vague references to it. "I cannot remain silent about the great sin being committed in the name of piety," she had written just weeks before her death. "Agatha speaks of purification and divine calling, but what I witnessed in that underground chamber was nothing less than the systematic mutilation of souls along with flesh. The cleansing she performs has twisted her own spirit beyond recognition, and Iris has become her willing accomplice in horrors that mock everything we were taught about healing and mercy." The final entry was dated just 3 days before her mother's sudden death, and the words seemed to leap off the page with desperate urgency. "I can no longer pretend ignorance of what happens in this house after dark. The cellar holds their righteousness and my regret. If anything happens to me, if my conscience finally demands action that puts me in danger, let whoever finds these words know that 27 men have entered this house seeking healing and left as something less than they were. God forgive me for my silence, and God help whoever must eventually speak the truth I lack the courage to voice." Ara's hands trembled as she closed the journal, her mother's final words echoing in her mind like a death knell for every hope and assumption that had sustained her since arriving at this house. 27 men, something less than they were. The cellar holds their righteousness and my regret. The fragile sense of belonging she had built over the past month crumbled like sand, leaving her alone with the terrible knowledge that the women she had begun to love were hiding secrets that had driven her own mother to her grave. The opportunity Ara had been dreading, yet desperately seeking, arrived on a moonless November night, when a young railroad worker appeared at their door, his face gaunt with exhaustion, and his clothes bearing the telltale coal dust of the mountain lines. She watched from the top of the stairs as Agatha welcomed him with her usual stern efficiency, while Iris hovered nearby with that peculiar mixture of maternal concern and something else, something that Ara now recognized as anticipation, tinged with guilt. The man spoke in hushed tones about problems with his constitution, about weakness that had plagued him for months, and about rumors he'd heard that the Blackwood sisters could provide discretion along with their healing. "We can indeed help you," Agatha assured him, with the confidence of someone who had offered these same words countless times before. "But such treatments require complete isolation and absolute trust in our methods. You must be prepared to surrender yourself entirely to the process, for anything less than complete submission will render our efforts useless." Ara retreated to her room and waited, forcing her breathing to remain slow and steady as she listened to the familiar sounds of her aunts preparing for one of their specialized treatments. She heard the soft murmur of voices, the careful footsteps descending what she had always assumed were the cellar stairs for storage, and then the distinctive sound of the forbidden door closing with its heavy iron lock sliding into place. Only when the house had been silent for nearly an hour did she dare to move. The floorboards seemed to announce every step as she crept through the darkened hallway, but her aunts were so absorbed in their work below that even her most careless movements went unnoticed. Through the kitchen window, she could see a faint glow emanating from what appeared to be a cellar window she had never noticed before, positioned on the far side of the house and partially concealed by overgrown shrubs. Moving with the desperate caution of someone whose very life depended on remaining undetected, Ara made her way outside and positioned herself where she could peer through the grimy glass. What she witnessed in those terrible minutes would haunt her for the remainder of her life. The cellar had been transformed into something that resembled a physician's surgery, but twisted into a nightmare version of healing. Clean white sheets covered a wooden table that had been modified with leather restraints at strategic points. Glass bottles containing various solutions lined shelves along the walls, and medical instruments that gleamed with recent sterilization lay arranged on a smaller side table with the precision of ritual objects. The young railroad worker lay unconscious on the main table, his body positioned with clinical efficiency, while Agatha worked with the focused intensity of someone performing a sacred duty. But it was the expression on her aunt's face that truly terrified Ara, not the fevered madness she might have expected from someone committing such atrocities, but rather a calm satisfaction, the look of someone fulfilling what they believed to be their highest calling. Iris assisted with steady hands, passing instruments and adjusting the patient's position with the practiced ease of long experience. Neither woman spoke during the procedure, moving together with a synchronization that spoke of countless similar operations performed in this underground chamber. Ara fled back to her room before she could witness the conclusion of whatever horror was being perpetrated in the name of healing, but sleep proved impossible. She lay rigid in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling and trying to reconcile what she had witnessed with the women who had shown her such measured kindness over the past weeks. When morning came, she forced herself through the motions of normalcy. Morning prayers, breakfast preparation, the daily rounds of herb gathering, while inside her mind screamed with the need to understand the full scope of what her mother had discovered in this house of secrets. The opportunity came the following afternoon, when both aunts departed to attend a difficult birth in a neighboring hollow, a summons that would keep them away until well past dark. Ara waited until their wagon had disappeared into the forest before approaching the cellar door, with her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for escape. The lock proved surprisingly easy to defeat with a bent hairpin and the kind of desperate ingenuity that comes from absolute necessity. The cellar in daylight was somehow even more horrifying than her nighttime glimpse had suggested. The makeshift operating theater occupied only a portion of the underground space, but its sterile efficiency spoke of years of careful refinement and practice. Bottles of chloroform sat alongside more exotic chemicals she couldn't identify, while the leather restraints showed the wear patterns of frequent use. Most disturbing of all was the small table positioned near the head of the operating surface, equipped with what appeared to be crude instruments designed for procedures she couldn't begin to imagine. But it was the discovery of Agatha's personal journal hidden beneath a false bottom in a medical supply chest that finally revealed the full magnitude of the horror that had been unfolding beneath her feet. Written in her aunt's precise handwriting was a methodical record that read like a ledger of damnation. Each entry detailed a different patient, his sins as perceived by Agatha's twisted moral calculus, and the specific procedures performed to achieve what she termed purification of the flesh in service of spiritual redemption. The language was clinical, almost scientific in its detachment, but the underlying message was clear with terrifying precision. Agatha had been luring men to their home under the pretense of medical treatment, only to perform forced sterilization procedures that she believed would prevent them from spreading what she saw as the inherent corruption of masculine nature. Some entries were accompanied by sketches that made Ara's stomach rebel with revulsion. Anatomical drawings that showed not healing, but deliberate mutilation performed with surgical precision, but motivated by a hatred so profound it had corrupted every aspect of mercy into its opposite. 29 entries in total, each representing a human being who had sought help and instead found something infinitely worse than death. The most recent entries hinted at expanded procedures, crude attempts at what the journal referred to as calming the mind as well as the body for patients who proved resistant to their treatment or threatened to expose what had been done to them. These references were accompanied by diagrams that suggested primitive lobotomy procedures performed with ice picks and other improvised tools in this underground chamber of horrors. As Ara read deeper into the journal, she began to understand her mother's final entries with crystal clarity. The woman who had raised her, who had taught her about healing and compassion, had discovered the same terrible truth and been crushed by the weight of it. The references to 27 men in her mother's diary meant 2 additional victims had been claimed since her death. And the knowledge that she was living above this chamber of systematic torture filled Ara with a horror so profound that she found herself physically ill, retching into the corner of the cellar as the full implications crashed over her like an avalanche. With trembling hands, she copied several pages of the most damning entries, her tears blurring the ink as she transcribed her aunt's cold accounting of human suffering. Each word felt like a betrayal of everything she had believed about family, about healing, and about the possibility of finding redemption in a world that could harbor such calculated evil. When she finally climbed back up those cellar stairs and locked the door behind her, Ara knew that her childhood, her innocence, and her faith in human goodness had died in that underground chamber, along with 29 men whose only crime had been seeking help from women who had perverted every aspect of mercy into its darkest opposite. The weight of her terrible knowledge pressed down on Ara like a physical burden as she made her way through the early morning mist toward the town center. The copied pages from Agatha's journal hidden beneath her coat like contraband that could cost her life if discovered. Sheriff William Crawford maintained his office in a small building adjacent to the general store, and Ara had rehearsed her words during the sleepless hours before dawn, trying to find some way to make the unthinkable sound believable to a man who had known her aunts far longer than he had known her. She found him seated behind a scarred wooden desk, methodically cleaning his service revolver with the patient attention of someone who understood that survival often depended on the proper maintenance of tools. "Miss Blackwood," he said without looking up from his work, though his tone carried a warmth that gave her hope. "You're out early this morning. I trust your aunts are keeping you busy with their important work." The kindness in his voice nearly broke her resolve before she could begin, but the memory of 29 men steeled her courage as she placed the copied pages on his desk with hands that trembled despite her efforts to appear calm. "Sheriff Crawford, I need to report a crime. Multiple crimes, actually. My aunts they've been hurting people. Men who come to them for healing." Crawford's hand stilled on his revolver, and when he finally looked up at her, his expression had shifted from warmth to the kind of patient concern usually reserved for children reporting monsters under their beds. "That's quite an accusation, miss. I hope you have substantial evidence to support such serious claims against 2 of our community's most respected citizens." Ara pushed the papers closer to him, her voice gaining strength from the righteousness of her cause. "It's all documented in Agatha's own handwriting. She keeps a journal of every procedure, every victim. 29 men, sheriff, 29 human beings who came seeking help and left damaged." But Crawford didn't reach for the papers. Instead, he set down his cleaning cloth and leaned back in his chair with the expression of someone who had already made up his mind. "Miss Blackwood, I understand you've suffered a great loss with your mother's passing, and grief can sometimes manifest in unexpected ways. But what you're suggesting is not only impossible, it's deeply offensive to women who have dedicated their lives to serving this community. The dismissal in his tone hit her like a physical blow, but Ara pressed forward with desperate determination. Please just read what I've copied. The dates, the procedures, the names of some of the victims. You must have records of missing persons reports, men who disappeared after visiting their home. What I have, Crawford said with the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence, is a profound debt to your aunts that I can never fully repay. 3 years ago, when my wife Mary was dying of fever, and no amount of prayer seemed able to break it, Agatha and Iris worked for 6 days straight to save her life. They asked for nothing in return, refused any payment, and never once made me feel beholden to them for their service. Mary is alive today because of their skill and dedication. The personal nature of his connection to the sisters explained everything, and Ara felt her hope crumbling like sand beneath the tide. But Sheriff, if you would just look at the evidence— I'll look at no such thing, he interrupted with sharp authority. What I will do is give you some advice, young lady. This community has known and trusted the Blackwood sisters for over 20 years. They've saved countless lives, delivered dozens of healthy babies, and provided healing when no one else could offer hope. If you continue spreading these vile falsehoods, you'll find yourself very unwelcome in this town very quickly. Ara's second attempt at finding justice proved equally futile when she approached Reverend Marcus Thornfield at the small wooden church that served the scattered mountain community. The elderly minister listened to her story with the patient attention she had hoped to find in the sheriff. But his response revealed the same impenetrable wall of disbelief dressed in gentler language. "Child," he said with grandfatherly concern, "I can see that you're deeply troubled, and I don't doubt the sincerity of your distress, but what you're describing simply cannot be true. I've known Agatha since she was younger than you are now, and her faith has always been unshakable. She and Iris represent the very best of Christian charity in action." Even when Ara produced her copied pages and begged him to examine the evidence, Thornfield refused, with a kind of gentle firmness that brooked no argument. Sometimes, when we're grieving, our minds can play tricks on us. We can misinterpret innocent actions or even create elaborate fantasies that feel completely real. I think what you need is prayer and rest, not the kind of attention that spreading such stories would bring. The word spread through the tight-knit community with the speed of wildfire, and within days, Ira found herself transformed from the pitiable orphan who deserved sympathy into something far more dangerous, a disturbed young woman whose accusations threatened the reputation of their most beloved healers. Women who had previously greeted her with warm smiles now crossed the street to avoid her path. Men tipped their hats with cold politeness that barely concealed their contempt. Even the shopkeeper, who had always treated her with kindness, began watching her with suspicious eyes whenever she entered his establishment. The whispers followed her wherever she went, growing more poisonous with each repetition. They called her hysterical, ungrateful, perhaps even touched by the same madness that had supposedly driven her mother to an early grave. Some suggested that grief had unhinged her mind, while others wondered aloud whether she might be dangerous, given to such elaborate fantasies of violence and mutilation. Her only unexpected ally emerged in the form of Dr. Alistair Finch, a man whose medical training had taught him to trust evidence over emotion and whose scientific mind had long been troubled by inconsistencies in the sisters' miraculous cures. When Ara approached him with desperate hope and showed him the copied journal entries, his reaction was everything she had prayed for but failed to find elsewhere. "Dear God," he whispered as he read Agatha's clinical descriptions of procedures that violated every oath he had sworn as a healer. "These aren't the ravings of a mad woman. This is systematic. This is deliberate surgical mutilation disguised as treatment. But even Dr. Finch's support came with limitations that highlighted the impossible nature of her situation. "Miss Blackwood, I believe what you've shown me, and it horrifies me beyond description. But I'm one man against an entire community that has elevated your aunts to near sainthood. If we're going to expose this horror, we'll need more than copied journal entries. We'll need witnesses, victims willing to come forward, physical evidence that can't be dismissed or explained away." The revelation that even her single ally understood the futility of their position sent Ara into the darkest period of her young life. She began to understand her mother's final entries with crystal clarity, the crushing weight of knowledge that demanded action while circumstances made action impossible. Night after night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling while her aunts moved about the house below, continuing their work with the calm efficiency of women who knew themselves to be completely protected by the very community they were systematically victimizing. Agatha and Iris, aware now that their niece had discovered their secret, began treating her with a cold menace that made every moment in their presence feel like walking along the edge of a cliff. Meals became exercises in silent intimidation with Agatha's pale eyes studying Ara's every expression, while Iris hovered nearby with the nervous energy of someone expecting violence to erupt at any moment. The house that had briefly felt like home now felt like a prison, where she was being held by jailers who smiled when others were watching, but revealed their true nature in moments of privacy. The darkness that had consumed Ara's world began to lift, not through any dramatic revelation, but through the quiet realization that her mother's memory demanded more than righteous fury. It demanded strategic patience. In the weeks following her failed attempts to find justice through official channels, she had retreated into a contemplative silence that her aunts mistook for defeat, but which actually represented the careful gathering of resolve. Dr. Finch's words echoed in her mind during the long December nights when sleep eluded her. They needed witnesses, victims willing to come forward. Evidence that could not be dismissed by a community determined to protect its most revered healers. The breakthrough came through methodical detective work rather than divine intervention. Using the names and dates from Agatha's journal, Ara began making discreet inquiries about men who had visited the area seeking treatment and then disappeared from their communities without explanation. Dr. Finch, working under the pretense of conducting a medical survey for the County Health Board, helped her track down addresses and last known locations of several victims. Most had vanished completely, leaving behind confused families and abandoned responsibilities. But one name appeared in multiple sources with enough consistency to suggest he had survived whatever horrors had been inflicted upon him. James Whitmore had been a mill worker from a town 2 valleys over, known for his reliability and steady temperament, until his sudden disappearance in late September. Unlike the others, however, Whitmore had eventually been spotted living as a hermit in an abandoned cabin deep in the forest, sustaining himself through odd jobs performed for isolated homesteads, where his increasingly erratic behavior would attract minimal attention. The man who had once been considered a pillar of his small community had transformed into something broken and fearful, avoiding human contact whenever possible, and displaying the kind of profound shame that suggested terrible secrets. Finding him required 3 days of careful searching through the most remote sections of the mountain wilderness, but Ara persisted with the grim determination of someone who understood that this might represent her only chance for justice. She discovered Whitmore in a one-room shack that reeked of unwashed bodies and despair, huddled beside a barely adequate fire and showing the physical deterioration that came from months of poor nutrition and psychological torment. When she appeared in his doorway carrying a basket of food and speaking in gentle tones, his initial reaction was the violent panic of a cornered animal. "Please don't hurt me," he whimpered, pressing himself against the far wall with his hands raised protectively before his face. "I didn't tell nobody nothing. I kept my mouth shut just like she said. I've been good. I've been quiet. Please don't make me go back to that place." Ara's heart broke for this man who had been reduced to such abject terror. But she forced herself to remain calm as she showed him the copied pages from Agatha's journal, pointing to the entry that detailed his own mutilation with clinical precision. "James, I'm not here to hurt you. I'm here because I need your help to stop them from doing this to anyone else. Look at these papers. Look at what she wrote about what they did to you." The process of convincing him to trust her required hours of patient conversation, but slowly the full horror of his experience began to emerge through broken sentences and terrified whispers. Agatha had lured him with promises of treatment for what she claimed were symptoms of masculine corruption, had drugged him with chloroform, and had performed procedures so brutal and thorough that he would never again be capable of the normal life he had once taken for granted. The psychological torment had been as deliberate as the physical mutilation with Agatha, convincing him that his suffering was divine punishment for sins he couldn't even identify. "She said I was poison," he sobbed, as the truth poured out of him like blood from a reopened wound. "Said all men were poison, and she was cleaning us so we couldn't spread our sickness no more. Made me swear on the Bible that I'd never tell nobody what happened. Said if I did, she'd find me and finish what she started." When Ara finally convinced him to accompany her back to town and tell his story to Sheriff Crawford, the lawman's reaction was everything she had hoped for during those dark weeks of isolation and despair. Faced with a credible witness whose physical condition corroborated the horrific claims, Crawford could no longer dismiss the accusations as the fantasies of a grief-stricken girl. The sheriff's face went ashen as Whitmore described his ordeal in halting, shame-filled words. And when Ara produced the copied journal entries that detailed his specific case with nauseating accuracy, Crawford's hands shook as he read the clinical account of systematic torture disguised as healing. The confrontation at the Blackwood house unfolded with the terrible inevitability of a nightmare reaching its climax. Crawford arrived with 2 deputies and a warrant based on Whitmore's testimony, finding the sisters preparing for evening prayers with their usual serene composure. Agatha's initial response was predictable, indignant denial mixed with subtle threats about the consequences of persecuting godly women who had dedicated their lives to service. But when Crawford produced the copied journal pages and began reading specific entries aloud, the facade began to crack with shocking suddenness. Iris was the first to break, her nervous composure finally shattered by the weight of guilt and terror that had been building for months. She collapsed into a chair with a wail of anguish that seemed to come from the depths of her soul, confessing everything through tears and desperate pleas for forgiveness. The words poured out of her in a torrent of self-recrimination. 29 men mutilated in the name of purification. Procedures performed with surgical precision, but motivated by hatred so profound it had corrupted every aspect of mercy into its darkest opposite. Agatha's reaction was far more chilling in its complete absence of remorse. Even as the deputies placed shackles on her wrists, she maintained her rigid composure, her pale eyes burning with the fanatical certainty of someone who believed herself to be performing God's work. "You are all blind to the corruption that festers in the hearts of men," she declared, with the authority of a prophet condemning the wicked. "I have cleansed 29 souls of their capacity for sin, and I would do it again tomorrow if the Lord provided the opportunity. History will vindicate my righteousness when this world finally understands the necessity of such purification." The trials that followed sent shockwaves through the mountain communities, forcing an entire region to confront the comfortable lies they had told themselves about the darkness they had allowed to flourish in their midst. Both sisters were sentenced to life imprisonment, though Iris's cooperation and obvious mental deterioration earned her confinement in an asylum rather than the state penitentiary that claimed Agatha. The Blackwood house was burned by vigilantes 3 days after the sentencing, the flames visible for miles as the community attempted to purge itself of the physical reminder of its collective failure. Ara left the mountains that winter, carrying with her the deep emotional scars that would mark the remainder of her days, but also the hard-won knowledge that silence in the face of evil was itself a form of complicity. She had paid a terrible price for justice, her innocence, her faith in human goodness, and her belief in the possibility of finding safety in family connections. But 29 men had been avenged, and future victims had been spared the horrors of that underground chamber where healing had been perverted into its most monstrous opposite. The pursuit of truth had demanded everything she possessed, but in the end it had proved worthy of the sacrifice.